Hello, everyone. My name is Beck. I'm a dietitian and nutritionist from Melbourne, Australia. And today I'm delighted to present with Free From an Allergy for the virtual FODMAP show. So, big thank you to Free From an Allergy for having me join this show. And I'm very excited to be presenting on reintroducing FODMAPs back into your diet. So, this is phases 2 and 3 of the Low FODMAP Diet. So just a little bit about me. So I am a dietitian, as I mentioned, a nutritionist. I work in private practice for a clinic called FODMAP Nutrition and Dietetics. So I work specifically with people who are struggling with gut issues, and I really like to help them to sort of figure out what is going on, what their triggers are, and how we can improve that long term. So I work with people with irritable bowel syndrome, celiac disease, food intolerances, many other gut conditions as well. I've got a big passion for cooking and for culinary nutrition. So using cooking as a way of, creating delicious food that's not only healthy, but also good for our own individual sort of needs, which comes into play with food intolerance, of course. So I also consult for the FODMAP Friendly Food Program, so very much involved in working with FODMAPs every single day. So very excited to be talking about them today. So let's get into it. A bit of an outline on what I'll be talking about. Sorry, the top of that's cut off slightly, but going into phases 2 and 3 of the Low FODMAP diet. So an overview of what encompasses these phases, how we reintroduce FODMAPs and how to challenge FODMAPs, interpreting your challenge results. So what to do once you figure out which ones you react to more or tolerate FODMAPs that you tolerate well. Also overcoming the fear of symptoms, which can be a big aspect there. Practical tips and tools for reintroduction, what to do if it doesn't go so well, and developing a long-term plan for you. So some of my top tips that I share with my clients will be part of this presentation. So what does FODMAP reintroduction look like? Well, it can look like a lot of different things, really. But these are just a few examples, photos from my own phone, food that I've eaten that are great examples of reintroducing FODMAPs. So anything from the top here, we've got adding these are some broad beans, and adding those into like an otherwise low FODMAP dish because they are high in excess fructose. We've got things down here like adding some fried shallots, and there's some black beans, hard to see. But on top there, which is another way of reintroducing certain FODMAPs into a meal. We've got everything like rinsing and straining your beans and legumes. I'll go into that one later on too. Adding fruit in, some extra cheese and dairy into a salad. So various different ideas, and it can look a lot of different ways depending on where you are in this reintroduction phase. So phase 2 or phase 3. But a lot of this is sort of covering both of those. So it is the FODMAP virtual show, so I'm sure you're quite aware of what the Low FODMAP diet is by now, but a bit of an overview in terms of the phases of the Low FODMAP diet. So we've got phase 1, which is your elimination phase. This lasts 2 to 6 weeks, and it's kind of the very commonly spoken about part of going on a low FODMAP diet, where we reduce all the high FODMAP foods that you're eating and stick to low FODMAP foods to see if you can gain relief from your IBS symptoms. Phase 2 is when we start structured FODMAP reintroduction challenges, and this can go anywhere up to sort of like 3 months, maybe a little bit longer for some people, and it might be a little bit shorter for others if they're going, depending on the type of reintroduction schedule they're using. And then we go into phase 3, which is when we bring back the FODMAPs you tolerate well back into your diet and personalize your diet for you. So this is the one that lasts, forever. It's for the long run, and it's the ongoing phase. So I'm going to go into each of these today. So you've completed your elimination phase, and what to do from here. So this is where reintroduction really starts. What we firstly do is challenge one FODMAP subgroup at a time, which gives you an opportunity to test your tolerance at different doses and also identify whether you have high FODMAP triggers or which ones are the main triggers of your symptoms. So there's about 9 individual challenges to do, and they might last about 1 week each, depending on the schedule you're doing again. But it can go for a couple of months for that reason, or a few months for that reason. And then we sometimes do some more combined challenges after that. So then we've got phase 3, which is that one, which is the ongoing phase where we're bringing things back into your diet, building a personalized plan, and maybe then, also doing a bit of a loop back to doing some re-challenging, a bit of taking some of what you learned in phase 2 and re-challenging down the track as well. So why do we reintroduce FODMAPs? Often I see clients who have done elimination, they're actually feeling great, better than they have in such a long time. Massive reduction in their IBS symptoms, their gut is settled, and it's kind of like, why would I move away from this at all? But there are many reasons too, and I summarize it into 3 main reasons. So firstly, we want to understand your personal FODMAP triggers. Everyone is different, and it's very rare that someone reacts to all types of FODMAP subgroups with a severe reaction. Generally, there's a couple that might be your main triggers that we can, limit, and long term, you can develop an individualized plan that's best for you. Number 2, we want to improve your nutrition because sometimes going low FODMAP, you're cutting out certain foods sometimes, and it can be hard to get the right amount of nutrients in, particularly if you have, say, a vegan or vegetarian diet as well. But also, we want to get some prebiotics back into your diet to nourish your gut microbiome. So prebiotics are fuel for our gut bacteria, and they work to produce a whole number of different products called short chain fatty acids and metabolites that have wonderful effects on the body. So excellent for our gut health and for many other areas of our well-being. So if we can try and reintroduce more of these from food, such as FODMAPs, back into your diet, it's looking after your gut health in the long run. And then number 3, we want to make eating out a lot easier for you, more sustainable. We want to kind of, make it a lot easier to go to a friend's house and eat something, or to eat at a cafe again without worrying, to get that social element of health back into your routine. So the structured challenges, how this works in phase 2. So you challenge each FODMAP subgroup, you do it one at a time, and the baseline diet you're following is low FODMAP. So just the same as what we were doing in the elimination phase. And we use a particular challenge food that only has that one subgroup in it. So for example, using honey, because it's only got excess fructose, it doesn't have other FODMAPs in it. So when we want to challenge fructose, we want one that's just got fructose. So then we are eliminating as many variables as possible as what could be triggering symptoms. So we gradually increase the dose as well. We don't go in like all in with heaps of honey. We start small and we gradually increase, and you monitor your symptoms as you go, record those symptoms down, record bowel motions, pain, gas, all those sort of things, and then work with your dietitian to figure out, what that all means for you. So these are the various foods that we like to challenge. So we do all the different FODMAP subgroups, but we break some up into multiple challenges. So for lactose is D in FODMAP, the disaccharide. We can use milk, or we can use something like ricotta cheese or ice cream. For excess fructose, the M in FODMAP, we could use something like mango or honey. For fructans, we like to break that into 4 different challenges because people often tolerate the fruit fructans very differently to the wheat fructans or the onion fructans or the garlic fructans. So we tend to do them with one that's based on a wheat or a grain food like bread or pasta, an onion challenge and a garlic challenge separately. And we also do a fruit challenge. So for the fruit fructans, which could be something like raisins or persimmon, which is in season at the moment. So if you like persimmon, I do personally, if you like persimmon, it's a good time to challenge your fruit fructans. But there are also many other foods you can certainly use too. There's also so something like chickpeas or soybeans for your GOS challenge. Then for the polyol groups, sorbitol, we might use something like sugar-free mints or lychees, and mannitol, we might use a certain type of mushroom. Again, some mushrooms have multiple FODMAPs, so best to use one like portobello that's only got mannitol in it, or something like cauliflower potentially. So your dietitian can really help advise what the best test food is and work with you for that. often it depends on seasonality and access and sort of something that's easy enough to challenge with. So this is an example of what a challenge week might look like. So just say we're challenging your excess fructose tolerance, and we're going to use honey as that test food. It's a nice and easy one to use, shelf stable. So if you don't, you probably have honey sitting there in the pantry anyway, even if you haven't been eating it for the last few weeks. So the day before you start, you want to make sure that your diet is baseline low FODMAP diet and having minimal symptoms. Sometimes we get random IBS symptoms, so we want that to be nice and low, feeling well settled. And then you start with day one, which is what we call a moderate dose. So we start like a little bit higher than what you're allowed on the low FODMAP diet. FODMAPs aren't black and white. There's not like, the FODMAP content will vary depending on how much of the food you're eating. So that's why we start with that sort of smaller amount, which might be about 1.5 teaspoons of honey. Then you might take a day off, have a rest day, let those symptoms settle down, let that pass through. And then we increase your dose on day 3, day off, increase your dose on day 5 as well, to quite a very high dose. See how you're monitoring your symptoms as you go along this week. And then we do a washout period for 3 days, which is to clear the FODMAPs out of your system before you start on your next challenge. So just an overview, you monitor your symptoms with each challenge. So things like whether you're getting constipated, diarrhea, abdominal pain, cramps, bowel motions, all those kind of symptoms. After completing the washout period, then you'll start on your next one. And you might also so this is a challenge week that has a day off in between test doses. Sometimes you can do back-to-back days as well, where you might do day 1, 2, and 3. You're just increasing that dose on those 3 days. Usually this will depend on what kind of symptoms you have, and also what suits you best. So best to work with your dietitian on figuring out the best challenge schedule for you. So we can also do combined challenges. So once you've done all of those 9 different ones I listed individually, we might start doing some combined ones. So if you tolerate sorbitol pretty well and you tolerate fructose pretty well, then we might see, well, how do you go with something like apple or pear that has those 2 FODMAPs in the one food? So these are just on the left here, some examples of combined FODMAP foods, because food is very variable, and food doesn't just have one FODMAP in it. There's usually, a few or multiple in a lot of different fruit and vegetables at least. So this can be really helpful because it's also helpful to figure out what to do in phase 3 and where to go from here with reintroduction. So next slide. So a few of my top tips for doing your FODMAP challenges. Firstly, work with your dietitian. I've probably said that a few times already, but what we have to do is advise you on the test foods to use, the order of testing and the doses, your structure that you want to use for your challenge, and how to interpret those results most importantly. Working with a dietitian, I can't really emphasize that enough, and I know I am a dietitian, but it can really make the process a hell of a lot easier for you too. Then we do a gentle sort of reintroduction. That's also an option. So for some people, like I might use this if someone is on a restrictive diet, say vegan or vegetarian, and we just want to sort of see if we can get some FODMAPs back into your diet sooner rather than later, than doing like a really long-term approach. We can do more of a gentle or simple reintroduction. Same with children or people who are elderly, people who we're just quite conscious of making sure you're not missing anything and being too strict for too long. So definitely working with a dietitian can help with doing more of that gentle type of reintroduction and show you how to do that. It might look like including one of the food groups sort of back into your diet, or a food that you were regularly eating before that was high, say like apple, but you never noticed symptoms before. We might just bring that straight back in as normal. So it looks different for everyone, but it is an option. You also don't have to complete all the doses. So if you do your first dose of your challenge, you get terrible symptoms, you feel awful, I usually suggest to take a day off, wait a bit, let those symptoms settle, then maybe try it again with half that amount, just to double check it wasn't an odd day, that you just had a bad gut day. But also if you're progressively getting symptoms as you go and getting moderate to severe symptoms, you don't have to keep going and increase your dose of the challenge week. You can stop when it gets pretty bad. And then how to tolerate, and how well you tolerate FODMAPs can really change over time. So re-challenge, re-challenge, and re-challenge. I really recommend it. It might be like 6 months down the track that you re-challenge a food, even if you didn't do too well with it the first time. Your gut microbiome can change significantly over time, and that has a big influence on how well we tolerate food, like FODMAPs. Stress levels, what's happening in your life, how your sleep's going, all these things can have a big impact on symptoms. So it's worth re-challenging later down the track, even if it doesn't go so well the first time. So then we look at interpreting those challenge results. So this is again where you kind of get some advice from your dietitian. But essentially what we look at is how well you tolerate it. So we get out your challenge sheets and we go through each of those. So if you had little to no symptoms throughout the challenge, that's excellent, beautiful, eat freely and bring those foods back into your diet. So that would be an example, would be like if you tolerated garlic really well, then let's get that flavoursome food back in. Then we do, so if you've got moderate to severe symptoms with that small dose, dose 1, we'd call that quite a strong reaction, or quite a sensitivity to that FODMAP. So we treat that one with quite a lot of caution, and we probably want to steer clear of it most of the time. If you were getting moderate to severe symptoms with that medium dose, so your medium dose you weren't reacting to very well, you might actually tolerate that FODMAP group in small portions. So an example with the garlic might be if you had a sauce that had garlic as one of the ingredients in it, maybe towards the end of that ingredient list, you might start to tolerate that amount of garlic better than, say, using a full garlic clove in cooking. And then if you've got some symptoms to that large dose, you're probably, the large doses with the challenges are pretty big for anyone to eat. Like 2 tablespoons of honey is quite a lot, or there's various different sizes, but the large challenge size is quite big. So you might be able to eat those ones in moderation. An example here is using like a little bit of garlic in a stir fry, not a whole lot, for example. So in general, there's no set rules for then your reintroduction and personalization phase of your low FODMAP diet. So this is actually phase 3, a little bit of a typo there. But if we're looking at phase 3, how that all works, that personalization, this is where we start reintroducing those well-tolerated ones back into your diet and experimenting with some of the foods that you tolerated in those moderate amounts. We also look at, so use, for example, one test food for your challenge, that might be honey for fructose. Well, if you tolerated that well, then let's try other fructose foods like mango or asparagus or sun-dried tomatoes and see how you go with those ones as well. Then we also monitor your symptoms as you reintroduce, just to get an idea of what's working well for you in your body and your gut. Avoid or limit those ones that we don't tolerate very well, and then consider that re-challenging down the track. So some examples to break that out into like this phase 3 and what that might look like. So a lot of words on this page, but your well-tolerated FODMAPs, we want to start reintroducing those into meals as you would have usually eaten them. And maybe try combining 2 or more of the well-tolerated FODMAP groups together. So if you tolerate, for example, wheat really well, and you tolerate, let's use mannitol as another example. You tolerate wheat and mannitol really well. I've got this example down here too. Then let's try adding wheat noodles and something like mushrooms that are high in mannitol together in that one meal and see how you go with those together. Then you might do a combined food as well. The apple, if you tolerate sorbitol and fructose, that's a combined challenge. And another example here might be, so if you tolerate onion and wheat but not garlic, then maybe making your pasta sauce with your normal pasta, normal wheat pasta, onion, and using your garlic infused olive oil, which is low FODMAP anyway, so you're not increasing that load there. Moderately tolerated FODMAP. So this is kind of a bit of a grey area, but we want to try and include these in small serves occasionally. So it might be starting with every few days. You might have a little bit, part of a low FODMAP meal, just to not overdo it too much. So an example might be sprinkling a few fried shallots on a Vietnamese chicken salad made with, rice noodles, which are low FODMAP and no other high FODMAP ingredients. It might be trialing out something like chickpea pasta, so pasta made from chickpea flour, with a low FODMAP sauce, just to see how you go with that increase in the GOS in the chickpea pasta in a larger amount. It might be trying a muesli that's got ingredients in it saying it's got honey and maybe a little bit of apple, trying that in a small dose. And maybe even using like a spice seasoning that's got a bit of onion and garlic in it to flavour your low FODMAP meal. So your otherwise low FODMAP meal. So might be cooking some chicken with that seasoning with a bit of onion garlic powder and then just serving it with low FODMAP veggies and some rice. And then we've got your poorly tolerated FODMAPs. So this is the area where you'll probably avoid these most of the time. There might be situations where it's tricky too, so you're eating out or eating at a friend's house, or you just want to eat it because you want to have a bit of a cheat day, so to speak. Then that's okay. You're allowed to do that. They're not going to hurt you. FODMAPs don't cause any damage structurally to the gut. From what we know. So it's not harmful. It might just trigger some symptoms, but if you know how to deal with that, then that's okay. If you are eating out and you think you might be coming across some of those really, one of your bigger triggers when you eat out, you're not sure how you're going to go at avoiding it, then maybe try to focus on low FODMAP meals before, the day before and the day of, so that your baseline is really nice and low. Increases your tolerance when you're going to go out and maybe eat something else. And then, so once we start reintroducing FODMAPs, there can be a bit of a fear of developing or of coming across symptoms, because IBS symptoms can be absolutely debilitating and really uncomfortable. So here are some of my tips to overcome some of this fear. One thing is to remember that those FODMAPs don't do damage to the gut, like I said. So even though you might be feeling like there's a lot of pain going on, it's not causing structural damage. It's not affecting, increasing your risk of anything like bowel cancer or other gut, related diseases in the long term. It's important to remember that FODMAPs aren't the only thing that can trigger symptoms. So sometimes we get so focused on blaming food and blaming FODMAPs, but a bad night's sleep can kind of set off your gut often. Dehydration, there's so many things that I'll go into detail of, and stress, of course, is a big trigger of IBS symptoms. So sometimes just take a look at the bigger picture. It might not only be the food that caused some symptoms to occur. Plan a good day to do reintroduction if you're a little bit worried about it. So, maybe not do it on a work day, maybe wait till you're on holidays or on the weekend, or try to plan your challenges to do them over the weekend, so you've got a little bit more of a rest day if you need to take that time off if symptoms occur. Don't forget about your IBS toolkit. So if things don't go so well and you do have some symptoms, think of your IBS toolkit. So that might be having, some stress management tools, might be a heat pack on your tummy, some peppermint tea, Iberogast, or peppermint oil capsules can also be helpful. So there's various things that work well for you. And this is a big one that I like to focus on, but what language we're using around FODMAPs. So often people will say like FODMAPs are bad, or they, terrible, or I'm allergic, or all these kind of things. And they're not bad foods, they're just FODMAPs. Garlic is just garlic. And trying to change that dialogue we're having around FODMAPs might actually sort of make it a lot easier to go into reintroduction, or to when we come across these foods, we're not too overwhelmed and scared about them. At the end of the day, they're just FODMAPs, they're just food. So some practical tips for reintroduction. Now, this is where the fun can happen. So I'm just going to go through each of the FODMAP subgroups and give you some tips on what and ways we can start reintroducing these things in that phase 3. So lactose, you might start with just having, if you tolerated it, moderately well, you might start with having it just in small portions, a bit on cereal, a bit in your tea. Something like lactose-free milk can still be a useful one to have. It's still nutritionally great. But also in the case of, for example, with coffee, you might want to stick to having a lactose-free milk, because coffee can be a gut irritant. due to the caffeine and the chlorogenic acid in it. So, maybe to reduce the effect that might have, stick to your lactose free with coffee and have your lactose dairy in other areas. Things like Greek and natural yogurts and kefir, which is a fermented milk product, contain live cultures that can sometimes break down some of the lactose. So they're not lactose free, so to speak, unless they have the enzyme added, but they might be lower in lactose and easier to start off with. And then things like your sort of softer cheeses that are high FODMAP in large doses, maybe just start including those a little bit more regularly, like ricotta cheese or halloumi. And also our good old lactase enzymes, which you can buy from a pharmacy, can be quite helpful. I usually recommend if you're eating out, that might be where you'd like to try using a lactase enzyme. So this is the enzyme that breaks down lactose into smaller sugars, and often people who have lactose intolerance are they don't have very much of this enzyme naturally in their body. So taking these enzymes can be helpful to mitigate symptoms. Then we've got fructose. So swapping things like fruit juices for smoothies that normally have some yogurt or some milk in them, less fruit juice and more whole fruit in the smoothie, generally a bit better tolerated than concentrated fruit juice, which can be higher in fructose. Keeping fruit to one sort of serve per sitting. So rather than going to town on a big loaded smoothie or smoothie bowl or fruit salad, maybe just have one piece of fruit or one serve of fruit at a time and wait a few hours before your next serve to reduce that fructose load. And if you're having something that might have a couple of high fructose foods in it, so like porridge with honey and apple, maybe swap that honey for maple syrup. So then your apple, you've got more of a better chance of tolerating it because maple syrup's low FODMAP, low in fructose, and honey's higher. And pairing your fruit with a source of protein, like maybe some cheese or some nuts, might actually make it easier to tolerate as well and slow down that rate of digestion with the fructose. And then we've got your fructans. So things like, swapping your lunch to keep your lunch maybe low FODMAP with a sourdough bread, and then you might have a regular wheat pasta for dinner. So that way you're kind of getting those fructans in, but you're just balancing out those sources so you're not having too high fructan meals per day. You might like to try different types of allium vegetables. So that's like your onion and your garlic and leek family. So you might do your challenge with brown onion, but maybe we want to see how you go with red onion or with shallots, or using more of the lighter green to white part of the leek or spring onion, which are where the FODMAPs become higher. So we can kind of start moving even just along the line of the leek to see how you tolerate those in different amounts. And maybe modifying your dish. So you've just got one main high fructan food. So that might be having gluten-free pasta with onion or garlic in the sauce, or a quinoa tabbouleh. So that's got onion in it, but no wheat. So it's just balancing those fructans out in total. And then we've got your GOS food group. So GOS is where we see beans and legumes come into play. Often people get quite scared of introducing these, but there's some real good tips you can use. Start small, start with a really small portion, maybe a tablespoon of beans, or teaspoon even each day. I know it sounds silly, but it can really help improve your tolerance. Strain and rinse canned legumes, beans and lentils really well. That reduces a lot of the FODMAPs because they often leach out into the canning water. So that can really help as an easy strategy. If you're cooking them from dry beans, just soak them overnight and then rinse them and then cook them and then rinse them. A lot of cooking and rinsing. So that can help to reduce those FODMAP levels too. Try different foods. So like you could try, for example, chickpea flour or those little roasted chickpea snacks. You might want to try lentil or chickpea pasta, and often find people do tolerate those quite well because they're more processed. They're probably lower in the GOS as well. And also, if you are sort of more for vegan and vegetarian diets, if you are following a plant-based diet, or anyone really, but rather than using GOS as your only protein source in a meal, look at other sources of protein you can add in. So something like tofu or quinoa or chicken or fish if you eat them, rather than it just being chickpeas, for example, because you want to get enough protein in your meal without having huge amount of FODMAPs that might upset your gut. There's also a specific enzyme that can help with digesting GOS as well. So not just any old digestive enzyme, but I'll go into the specific name soon. And then your polyol foods, you might want to start with just the food sources of polyols, because the polyol sugars we see artificially added to things a lot. So any of your sugar-free protein powders, drinks, chewing gum, mints, I usually recommend let's leave those aside and let's start with food sources first, because there's a lot more nutrients that you can also get out of food. And it might be just to start with increasing portions of your like food with low to moderate polyol levels. So that could be pumpkin or sweet potato or celery. And then also you might want to start trying to combine the polyols with other FODMAP foods. So then just a few tools for reintroducing. So those specific enzymes, lactase can be one to use, and then also something called alpha-galactosidase, which is the enzyme that can help us to break down GOS. Humans don't produce this enzyme, but it can help to produce to break down the FODMAP GOS, which is in those beans and legumes. Particularly might be worth speaking to your practitioner about if you are on a plant-based diet, because then we can get more higher protein, iron, and really important nutrients back into your diet more easily. Chew your food well. It's often overlooked, but it can make a big difference on digestive symptoms. So chew food well. Be careful of FODMAP stacking. I won't go too much into detail of this, but it can occur, and it's just something to be aware of. If you're not noticing symptoms, don't worry about it too much. Try to limit other gut irritants, so outside of FODMAPs. Track your menstrual cycle. This can be quite helpful, obviously, if you are someone who menstruates. But our digestive system and our gut symptoms can be very different at different stages of the cycle. So tracking that can help us to know when you're going to be heading into menstruation or ovulation and those times, and then we can plan reintroduction around that. So not reintroducing when we expect that you're going to be having some tummy pains around the time of your period, for example. Stress management, very important. So there's different things that can help that are very evidence-based for IBS, including gut-directed hypnotherapy and a few more there. Regular movement is really helpful when doing what works well for you. It might be a gentle walk or some yoga. For some people, it doesn't have to be vigorous or intense. Drinking sufficient water, and lastly, trust your gut. So even though it does have a bit of a mind of its own with IBS, it certainly is good to try and trust your gut and go in with a positive attitude with reintroducing. So just some of those other IBS triggers that are not FODMAPs, just to note and be aware of. It's not always FODMAPs that are triggering things, and if you're having coffee with a high FODMAP food, maybe it was the caffeine a little bit, or the coffee that stimulated your gut a little bit more too. So we can look at these other factors. But coffee and alcohol, capsaicin in chili can be one too. Fatty foods or fried foods, carbonated drinks sometimes as well. Fiber, the amount of fiber you're eating and the types of fiber can have a big impact on how your gut digests them and tolerates them. Fluid, so making sure you're having enough water, the right amount for you, and any other food sensitivities. So that could be food chemicals, it could be other things outside of FODMAPs. Then there's your non-food triggers, so stress or poor sleep, exercising maybe too much or not enough, because exercise can really help with, for example, giving us some endorphins and some level of stress management as well. Your menstrual cycle, as I mentioned, and also dehydration there too. If it doesn't go so well with reintroducing, you can certainly, it's not the end of the world. So I'd say try a different food. So for example, if you try chickpeas and they don't go well, try buttered beans. Try something else. It might actually surprise you. Try a smaller portion as well. And look at all the other alternative foods you can have. There are so many out there, even within the low FODMAP space of food that you can have. Try to make the most of those non-food management strategies for IBS, like doing yoga and sleeping well, and maybe medications if you need them, because they'll likely improve your tolerance of food as well. And try reintroducing again at a later time, because the FODMAP tolerance can change over time. And so just a quick recap. So with some of those food examples I showed earlier, start with your structured challenges. Identify, what those foods are that, or FODMAPs are that you're tolerating best, what you're not tolerating so well. Bring the ones back in that you can tolerate, and you can use some handy tips and tricks that I mentioned today to do that. Try to improve your overall nutrition and gut health by bringing these back in and getting in some of those prebiotics specifically. Other nutrients like calcium and iron and B12, zinc and protein, also very important, and you can get those from a lot of different foods when you reintroduce as well. And also improve your social health. So, trying to get a lot of that social side of eating and that psychological side of enjoying food and mental health back in with getting away from a strict diet and starting to eat out without worrying as well. So I always like to use this this term. You can have IBS and still live a great life, and I think that's really true with all the clients I work with. It's tricky to live with IBS, but it's manageable. It certainly is. So a bit of a summary from today: complete those reintroduction phases 2 and 3. Try to understand your personal triggers of IBS and increase that variety in your diet for social health and for nutrition, and work with a expert healthcare team. So specifically with these 2 phases, a trained dietitian who's worked in the area of FODMAPs and gut health will be able to support you immensely through this process. And if you do need any support on that note, these are my details here, so you can get in touch at FODMAP Dietetics to see if you'd like to book an appointment. I do one-on-one consultations, like I mentioned, in person in Melbourne, but also virtually interstate as well. So, and even overseas. So thank you so much today for watching this presentation. I look forward to seeing the rest of today's show. And yeah, stay well and enjoy your FODMAP reintroduction. Thank you.